All right, how about I'll just start with introductions and people can trickle in as they trickle in. So welcome to our webinar series, Health and Equity Making Systems Accountable. My name is Erin Wolfson and I work with the Division of Social Accountability in the College of Medicine in the role of Community Engagement Specialist. I'm just really happy to be here with you along with my colleagues. And we're just really happy that you decided to join us for this important discussion around poverty elimination and lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic with the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. So if this is the first time joining us, these monthly webinars are part of our way of gathering our community to have ongoing and timely conversations about equity and accountability so that we can continue to advance our knowledge, learning, and practice in this work. And we invite you to go if you feel comfortable. You can access the chat box. Just let us know where you're coming from. It's really great to know who is here with us today. And I just want to mention that we are recording this webinar. That's just so that we can make this available to others. So just that you're aware it's happening. Thanks so much for getting us started, Laura. And if you have the option of turning your video on, if that's available, we would love to see your face. It just does help us to build community and connections. So if you are able, then feel free to join us. And your audio, as usual, is muted to reduce feedback. But as I mentioned, it's always great to have your video on if possible. And if you want to change your name on the screen to reflect the name that you would like to use in this space, as well as if you feel called to put your pronouns so that we can make sure to honor those as well. And we begin today's webinar by acknowledging that we are Mean on Indigenous land, and the Division of Social Accountability is located on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of Métis in Saskatoon. And as a white settler and guest living on this land, I am just grateful for the opportunity to meet today on this land. In the DSA, we continue to learn about the history of systemic racism and discrimination for Indigenous peoples in our province and in Canada. And we also continue to grow our understanding of how that history is alive today in our systems and in society. So on that note, just before we get started, I just am going to pause here for a moment, and I'd like to invite you, wherever you are joining us, to do your own silent acknowledgement of the land. And as we do that, in this moment of pause, maybe just connecting in with what brought you here. Maybe taking a few breaths on your own time. And if this is the first time sort of taking a pause all day, maybe just really trying to notice where you are in your room. Maybe noticing the weight of your body on the chair, wherever you're sitting. And just using these breaths in this moment of pause as an opportunity for your thoughts to settle and check in and just notice how you're doing. And as we do that, what you're here for, what brought you here. And if you feel comfortable sharing that in the chat, just notice what's coming up for people right now, what's present for people right now. And just acknowledging that, in the context of what's happening in our community and that we're having this conversation after a pretty hard week that has been heavy on many hearts. And so, just as we go through this conversation, just holding yourself gently. And we acknowledge that these conversations have different impacts. So show up in the way that you need to. And however you got here, wherever you are, just welcoming you to this space and just really, really appreciate you all being here. And on that note, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today, who is not a stranger for many of you, but I asked her to share a bio because we don't get to celebrate her enough. So Colleen Christopherson-Cote is the coordinator of the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership, or SPRP. And if you've been following our webinar series for a while, then you've actually probably heard Colleen talk before. It's been wonderful to co-present with her several times. Colleen is a community development consultant with more than 20 years of experience who specializes in collective impact and human services policy and practice. Over the last 9 years, she has lived in Saskatoon, working in a variety of roles, including the coordinator of SPRP, co-coordinator of the Safe Community Action Alliance, director of the evaluation at the Saskatoon Housing Initiatives Partnership, and coordinator of the Saskatoon Early Years Partnership, just to name a few. Most recently, she's had the opportunity to work as the incident command for the Saskatoon Interagency Response to COVID-19, a community collective action project that supports the agencies who provide services to many of the most vulnerable Saskatoon residents. Colleen weaves webs of relationships that not only break through the confines of system silos, but also disrupt the hierarchies within them that so often prevent timely, holistic action on critical issues. Colleen's colleagues celebrate her ability to find clarity in chaos, to pull diverse perspectives into a unified vision, and to carve collective paths forward, even when it's not the path of least resistance. Please join me in offering a virtual warm welcome to Colleen, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erin. It's always interesting to give a bio when many of the folks on the call work with me all the time, and so many familiar faces. I don't see all of the boxes because I'm sharing a screen. I actually won't see the chat either, so I think Erin agreed that she would take care of the chat for me. But by all means, drop comments and questions into the chat as we go. This is the formal launch of a supplemental document that we put together over the course of the last sort of handful of months in response to what we saw happen throughout the COVID response, which is still ongoing. We're still in sort of COVID normal COVID response. We're just not in a deep emergency response at this point. And so I'm grateful for the DSA to provide us opportunities to share and to have public spaces like this to share the work in a collaborative way. So it's a pretty in-depth conversation. The document is quite lengthy. I'll drop in the chat a link to the actual document so you can download it and read it in its entirety. But these are the sort of snippets that we wanted to focus on moving forward. So before, see, there's always a technical glitch. There we go. Before we get going, a little bit about the SPRP, which is the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. It was created in 2009 out of a community charrette. In 2008, there was a health disparities report co-authored by Dr. Corey Neudorf that shone the light on poverty in Saskatoon and in the province. And in that charrette, the SPRP, or an organized conversation around poverty reduction in Saskatoon, was born. It is governed by Constellation governance, and we have since, over the years, embedded the collective impact model. If you're interested in those two things, we can add additional connections to those. I'm not going to go into great details about it. The team itself is organized into 3 groups. There's a management team that organizes myself as a half-time coordinator and all the funding. There's a big leadership team that sets the common agenda and sort of the work forward. And then inside the constellations are all the action teams. This will be important when we get to the next steps. And then there are 3 foundational guiding principles to the SPRP. Nothing about us without us. All of this work is deeply rooted and connected to a group of folks who self-identify as having lived or living experience of poverty. We are all treaty people, and we're in the process of reconnecting and recommitting to our commitments to truth and reconciliation, and that we're a city of bridges. And so that bridging piece is that the SPRP is much more about networking and building pieces than it is to actually doing project-based work. So we organize the work in 4 C's. We convene things, we catalyze things, we coordinate things, and we collaborate. It's interesting, we sent out the request for this and there were a couple of questions around how does this work actually come to be? And so I added a couple of slides, and that's why I'm spending a couple of minutes on this. You'll also link and give Erin a copy of the slide deck. There are linked documents in all of this slide deck. But when we look at the word collaborate, which is a relatively new word that not a new word, but a new piece of the work that we've added to this section, I wanted to just spread the definition very clearly that when we talk about collaboration, this is what we're talking about. And so throughout the document, you'll see that it's a really purposeful weaving of work. And so when we talk about collaboration at the SPRP, we're talking about the engagement of all people to create this environment that is conducive to solving complex problems. I've had a conversation recently that it doesn't have to be a complex problem that you're collaborating around. It just so happens that poverty and the work that we're doing is fairly complex. and that it's rooted with plausible solutions. There was a question pre this meeting around Overton windows, and so we really try to situate the work in things that are plausible. Once we start talking about the actual ideas, you may challenge that a bit, and that's a really great thing. So we should talk about how plausible the bold ideas really are. And then when you come together to work with us, we take a personal responsibility and agency-based responsibility to catalyze all of the assets and contributions into action. And so this is the work that the SPRP is focused on for the next, well, it has been focused on in the past and will be focused on in the next handful of years. Before COVID, so in 2019, we launched the 12 Bold Ideas to Eliminate Poverty in Saskatoon. The public launch was in February of 19. That document was built out of multiple months of surveys and interviews and collective action across the province. We also went through a ton of different agency documents and government documents, etc., to formulate these ideas. And it launched in February, and we were working on it, and then COVID. So before COVID hit, the 12 Bold Ideas were situated around these 12 things. So income, assets, social enterprise, childcare, education, healthcare, transportation, access to good food, access to housing, justice, particularly pertaining to women and the apprehension of children, access to literacy, and system navigation. The link in this is the old document. And so it's really important to note that this new document that we're talking about today is a supplement to these things. All the work in this document, the 2019 document, is still on the table and will still be worked on. The lessons learned during COVID are simply a supplemental of things that we learned and gaps that we had identified. So in comes COVID. Remember March of 2020? It seems like 100 million years ago. And when we were talking about doing the work before we actually knew what COVID was, we really stopped and thought, like, is COVID going to disrupt the work that we're doing? Do we need to pivot the work and deal with COVID? And if we already know that pre-COVID and pre-pandemic, people were already facing health inequities and vulnerabilities to housing and food and other social determinants of health, what would happen when the pandemic really took on a focus and removed people and removed services and further and deepened potential social determinants of health and poverty issues? And so out of those conversations in March of 2020, the Saskatoon Interagency Response to COVID was born. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's still sort of functioning. It's not an emergency response, but over the course of the big pandemic response, this agency was responsible for ensuring the folks that pre-COVID had vulnerabilities or instability to housing and food weren't further marginalized by the pandemic response. And while we were doing that work, a bunch of different things emerged as lessons. And so that's why we took another look at the bold ideas and thought, how can we modify and take the lessons learned during this COVID response and create a supplemental that we could focus on so that we could pivot the work in a more productive and effective way. So during the response, we saw all the 12 bold ideas in some capacity implemented or addressed by a multitude of different jurisdictions. It could be the municipal government, it could be the community, it could have been the provincial or federal governments, and also indigenous governments. All of them, income was addressed at a federal level, it was talked about, and I also preface that it doesn't mean that it was done well, it just means that it was addressed and that it became a topic for consideration during the pandemic response. We could all argue that perhaps CERB, the federal benefits, did not roll out the best way, but had intentions around providing supports and income supports for folks. That we saw really quickly that people who had assets had different capacities to deal with the pandemic than folks who didn't have assets, and how important asset building is. We saw social enterprise show up because the traditional conventional models of business started to change as doors closed and things changed in access. And so we saw social enterprises blossoming in certain aspects of work. We saw the direct pressures of childcare and education, K-12. So I should preface education in this conversation is K-12. And the relationship between families who need access to childcare, who have children in particularly K-6, and what happens when the K-12 programming is disrupted to the point where parents can't get access for their children. We clearly saw there were healthcare issues, and this is a health-related pandemic, and so we'll talk a little bit more specifically about health after. We saw the city of Saskatoon make transportation free. We saw other city and other jurisdictions make transportation free during the COVID response, and we learned some lessons around what that looked like. We saw tremendous capacities around accessing food, particularly as people couldn't get around the city, as stores closed, as smaller businesses are facing closures and the pressures around pandemic business modeling. We saw tremendous gaps around housing. That's a big one. We're going to talk about it in a bit. We saw issues with justice. We saw inequities around the justice system. We saw inequities around access to vaccine as that started to fall. And we also saw an alternatives to remand that is a positive piece that we could build off of. And so we're going to sort of refocus there. The literacy piece we saw a ton of different supports around access to technology. We saw a large group of folks surrounding and wrapping services around families to ensure that what was going on in K-12, but also in other jurisdictions and other learning environments, that people still had access to the services and supports they needed for literacy. And we also learned very quickly that system navigation, particularly for this sector, requires face-to-face human interaction. And when you cut that out, it becomes highly problematic for a lot of people. So we saw all these things happening. We were working through them as they were sort of coming at us. And there were some really glaring, serious gaps. And as we were working to ensure that we could gap fill during the height of the emergency response, we were also keeping notes, keeping evaluation going. We had the interagency response had an entire evaluation team keeping track of those pieces. And then when we could take a step back sort of in the summer, we realized that there were some fundamental pieces that we should add to a poverty elimination strategy or strengthen. And so this conversation around building this supplemental report was born. So those gaps, there's one really big, well, I guess there's two really big gaps that didn't really show up in the first iteration of the report, and that was access to public washrooms and access to data. And so those two pieces, and I'm going to unpack them a little bit, are really huge gaps that we've added to the report. The other three pieces, the housing system, is that in fact, we don't have very good transitional or supportive housing in this province at all, but there are lots of opportunities there to talk about what that model could look like. And we also found out that every single day, the health authority medically discharged people to nothing. They medically discharged people to homelessness. And so that systemic piece needed to be addressed. We also saw a lot of barriers around harm reduction. And not just sort of a conventional, your mind might automatically go to like a managed alcohol program or safe consumption, but harm reduction in a larger scale, a situation where systems or agencies or supports aren't allowed to create harm in any way. And so really taking a high level approach to what harm reduction could look like if all systems addressed their policies and practice with that lens. And then the final thing was that throughout the entire pandemic response for the interagency response in Saskatoon, there was no provincial dollars provided. All the money and all the resources came from seconded agency staff and external community dollars. And so what is the role of the provincial government in really funding the policies and practices around poverty reduction? The other thing that we addressed in the first document, but didn't do it bold enough, in our opinion, was the things that we were learning about racism. And so we saw over the course of the pandemic response, a deepening commitment from community to talk more clearly and boldly about the intersectionality between poverty and racism. And talking specifically with the Anti-Racism Network around how we can better include our commitments to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice, and which calls to action are specifically the ones that we should be focusing on. And so this document calls specifically to talk about the TRC Commission's call to action number 47. And this is about long-standing ways that things are governed and how we can disrupt those government policies and talk differently about creating a anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens to policy and There are a bunch of other TRC calls to action that we're embedding in the work, and that piece will be another supplement coming probably after the release of this document. So I just want to pause and say, you can look at the previous document, and that work still exists, and we're still working on the calls that are the commitments that are in that document. This document is meant to supplement that document and say, you know, these are the things that we learned, and this is how we plan to pivot the conversation around poverty elimination in Saskatoon. And I mean, and in general, lots of this jurisdiction can be provincial wide. So if there are people here who are not from Saskatoon, by all means, you're going to see your communities and your needs shown in these ideas. So how did we change things up? We had to make room because we were going to make a new bold idea around public washrooms. And so what we did was combine income and assets together because they are really kind of interconnected. And then historically, we hadn't talked about income in the same way that we're going to start talking about it moving forward, and really talking about the relationships between how people get income, where that income is with respect to the living wage, the market basket measure, which is the Canadian poverty line, and other sources, including income assistance. So that made room for one extra new idea, and that's about public washrooms. And then the other ones are similar. The food one, we really sort of pivoted away from programmatic food and emergency food to talk more specifically about access to food and the continuum of access to food. So emergency access to food is a critical need. And then there's some transitional food models in between, and then there's food sovereignty. And so what does that look like, and how do we talk about that in its entirety? Housing, justice stayed similar. Literacy, all the literacy ideas from the original document are still intact, and we've added data and technology to the literacy section, and then system navigation stays the same. So in this document, on this link, you'll see this is the link to the actual new document. We'll share that at the end as well. So, I don't know, should I pause? Are there questions? We're all good? The document itself is organized in the sections, so you can pull the sections out, but it's important to note that they're all woven together. And when we talked about them in the original document for 2019, we were really purposeful in the weaving and the talk, and how you make changes to one aspect ripples out and makes changes into the others. And so you can't make a change to income or a change to transportation and not think about the ripple out and the subsequent impacts it would have on the other ideas. So in this document, we clearly defined what we were talking about from the SPRP's perspective and from this sort of works perspective around what we mean by income, what we mean by transportation. So each of the sections has a definition of what it is. And then rather than calls to action or recommendations, we at the SPRP made a series of commitment statements. And so historically, we hadn't talked about income in the same way that we're talking about it now, but we're going to be a bit bolder around talking about income, because while income is not the end all and be all to eliminating poverty, it certainly is a critical piece. People simply need enough money to live above the poverty line. That is coupled then with a bunch of other social determinants of health and other factors. And so what we're saying around income is that we are going to be committed to advocating for a guaranteed basic income system. This is not a universal basic income system. This is a conversation around what people need, where they are to live above the market basket measure. And that basic income systems have to take into consideration the poverty line. You can't create a basic income system that is below the poverty line. That doesn't make any sense. And then also talking about, there's a lot of chatter, even today, I think yesterday, the Ontario government made a commitment to $15 a day, $15 an hour minimum wage. That we're more interested in making sure that the minimum wage and the living wages are aligned, because even $15 an hour is lower than our living wage. And so we need to have a really good understanding between, you know, where our living wage is and what our market basket measure line is, and what money is required for folks to live above that, depending on the circumstances that they're in and depending on what their needs are. We're also committed to advocating for or against potentially what's going on with the Saskatchewan Income Assistance Program. and increasing awareness to its inadequacies from a policy perspective, but also from just a dollars and figures perspective. And that we're interested in talking about the role that asset building is playing, and how people who live in poverty are actually penalized and often victimized and potentially even criminalized for building assets, and how important and critical assets actually are in getting above the poverty line. I'm going to show you a graph. So we actually looked at, we're using the living wage as a benchmark. So the living wage is the largest dollar figure. It's the one that says that you can, that's the one that says you would live sort of a reasonable sort of state, paying your bills and being able to sort of do the things that you want to do in society. And so we looked at market basket measure, which is the official Canadian poverty line. We also looked at the Sask income assistance, so SIS, that's the new income assistance program. And then we looked at the CERB, which CERB is was not an annual, it didn't last for 12 months, but if we looked at CERB as an annual benefit like a basic income, where does it land at $2,000 a month? And then we also looked at the current Sask minimum wage and where is it with respect to these dollar figures. And so you can see the first graph. So the line across the top is the living wage. This is what we're striving for. So for a single earner, it's about $2,500 a month. If you look at income assistance, how much lower it is. The second bar is the poverty line. So you can also see how low income assistance is based on the poverty line. And then as you see a basic income like CERB, a little bit higher, but still not reaching the benchmark of living wage, and the minimum wage a little tiny bit higher than CERB. And so you'll see a lot of arguments in the news, in the news right now about how CERB has disrupted minimum wage earners and that employers can't hire minimum wage earners anymore because they're more likely to take CERB benefits. But you can see that the relationship between those two dollar figures isn't that much different. And so it opens a conversation as to what's going on with minimum wage employers. The second graph is if you had two income earners, because the market basket measure is a two income earner, two kids, it's a sort of standard family unit. We thought we'll take a look at what it would look like as a family of four. So in a family of four, this is what the numbers look like. Again, the shocking piece is how much lower Saskatchewan income assistance is than the living wage, and even than the market basket measure, which is the official poverty line. So we're going to use a lot of this work to talk really specifically and advocate really specifically about, you know, people need to have income that's higher or at the benchmark of living wage in order to disrupt these cycles. And so you'll hear a little bit more from SPRP around income than you have in the past. Public washrooms is the next big hot topic right now. I spent a lot of time talking about bathrooms because in COVID, we spent over 100 days without access to any public washrooms. And so early on in that response, as reopen started to happen, we realized that we and I mean, Regina and other agencies and other communities were in the same boat in this province, that we didn't have an adequate model to provide universal access to public washrooms. And in fact, it's a 2015 United Nations universal human right that was assigned as people have access to sanitation. And so we're actually in violation of a United Nations General Assembly declared universal basic human right. And so we're working on those pieces right now. It doesn't mean that all the washrooms in Saskatoon need to be open 24/7. That's not a feasible or plausible model. But we can take a look at what are the barriers to accessing, who has what infrastructure, and how do we then fund and support that infrastructure. And so that work is ongoing. Social enterprise is an ongoing piece. There are lots of really amazing social enterprises in Saskatoon and across this province. And so we're just committed right now to supporting the existing models and really advocating around social enterprise being another tool in sort of the business and economy side of this conversation to supporting folks. I'm going to flip through some of them. Some I'll spend a bit more time on, but I'm also cognizant of the time, so I want to leave some time for questions as well. Early years, you may have noticed in and around, there's been so many elections, but the federal election most recently, just before the federal election, there was an announcement from the federal government to invest in childcare across Canada. And Saskatchewan entered into an agreement with the federal government just prior to the writ dropping for the federal election. And so the SPRP, rather than reinventing the wheel, is simply committed to increasing the awareness around why we need to invest in the early years and why you break cycles of poverty when you invest in families with children birth to age 12, but also working in partnership with a new coalition called Childcare Now Saskatchewan, which is an arm of the national Childcare Now group, around building and operationalizing the roadmap for that federal government investments to ensure that equity is placed on the policy, equity lens is placed on the policy when implementation happens. K-12 is interesting, right? We saw K-12 responding, and I'm sure there are folks on the call who have kids in varieties of different grade levels. My kids are in high school. And so when we saw the disruption, the initial disruption happen, like schools closed, and then they scrambled around alternative school models. And so prior to COVID, we were talking to the education systems around, what could alternative school models look like? What could hybrid schools look like? What could online learning look like? How do you build a system that is about learning and not just necessarily about old industrial school models or policies that may not be as relevant as they were in sort of the 50s? And so we're hopeful that we'll take a ton of lessons out of the way that the school systems modified their learning environments. Some of it was positive for kids and some of it was negative for kids. And we need to take both sides of that spectrum and really have a conversation. But the commitment from SPRP is that good education system needs to be rooted around student learning, and that needs to be the focus. And so how do you build a system that is about student learning, not necessarily about bricks and mortar or F contracts or interpretations of summer vacation time off and all of sort of the legacy pieces of an industrial school model. There'll be a lot to learn. I suspect the education system will be doing a lot of internal evaluation around what they've learned around how they've modified their school systems. Health is a really complex one. We often talk about the complexity of this. And we know from the previous document, we talk about how poverty is a risk factor, but also that health is a risk factor for poverty. And it's a very complex cycle. And what impacts some doesn't impact others. And there's resiliency built into it. And there's a bunch of different sort of health-related inequities built into the health system. Our previous focus was really on using the health system as a point of entry and having practitioners in health assist with identifying needs and system navigation through a screening tool. We're still in that work actually was initiated before COVID. But as COVID emerged, what we really learned was that there is a significant disconnect between the concept of what harm reduction really is, and that the standard sort of more obvious definitions of safe consumption or managed alcohol, those kind of pieces, people understand, or people know what they are, but they don't fully understand how to implement them. They don't know how to resource them. And there's a ton of bias, misconception, systemic barriers, systemic racism tied to those projects, but also that harm isn't just, or harm reduction just isn't just about providing people with substance. It's actually breaking policies that perpetuate and create harm, like medical discharge to homelessness. And so how do we talk inside big systems, particularly the healthcare system, about breaking those cycles and really taking a hard look at where harm is created inside those cycles. And so we're in the process right now to talk really specifically about the interconnections of the health system creating harm and where inside policies outside of the health system, where health and those policies butt up against each other. So health and housing, health and community, health and income, those kind of things. So these are the commitment statements. So we're so committed to collectively working on harm reduction principles that are built into policy and practice, but then also looking at the intersectionality across the board ideas. That's kind of what I just said. It's a good thing I knew what I was going to say to the next slide. So transportation is a really interesting one. It's transit. The pre-COVID bold idea, which was always the one that I thought people would freak out about, was that we really want to talk about what it would mean to people in Saskatoon or in urban centers in general if a free to use transit system was implemented. Now, it doesn't mean it's free, because I understand that it costs money to run a transit system. And I also know that that doesn't then fall on the shoulders of taxpayers in Saskatoon. In fact, what it's supposed to do is look at a more innovative collective model in which to fund a free to use transit system. There are mechanisms in place across Canada where there are free to use lines, free to use times of day, and so we could start small. And we're in a really interesting place in Saskatoon because we have expansion happening with bus rapid transit, we have corridor expansion, and we have a bunch of different municipal investments going on. And so we're at a really nice place to talk about what free transit could look like. We also know that transit was free during COVID. And so what we want to do is talk about how much that cost and where that money came from and how we might be able to use the lessons learned during those couple of months of free transit use. Also to dispel myths around what people use transit for. Access to good food, like I said in the beginning, this is really about the food system itself. And so what we're really committing to at this point is that, first of all, in order to eliminate food insecurity, people need enough food to buy what food they want to buy, where they live, when they need it. We cannot eliminate food insecurity in the house with emergency food supports. Does that mean that emergency food supports aren't critical? No, it means they're critical, but we need to be talking about a continuum of services that includes talking about income. But we're also then committed to making sure that people can have access to food in their own neighborhoods when they need it and what they want to eat. And so we know there are lots of food deserts and food swamps in Saskatoon and across this province where people simply don't have good choice or good options. Even if they had enough money, they wouldn't be able to access it because they'd have to travel to get access to it. So we need to talk about the network of food. It doesn't mean that there needs to be a Loblaws in every neighborhood in Saskatoon, because that won't happen. I know that won't happen, but we need to figure out, and this is another idea around how do the bold ideas ripple out, right? So if we talk about income, we talk about transit, and we talk about how people got access to food in COVID times, we learned a lot about where people move about to get access to those food sources. And then the last piece is about traditional, cultural, and locally sourced. And so we need to start talking about, what can we do on a local scale to provide access to food? There was a large pilot project during the COVID response that looked specifically to access to Indigenous traditional foods, taking elders and youth to and from the land, and talking about conventional or traditional access to fish, wild meat, berries, medicines, etc. And how do we make sure that the policies and practices around food access aren't creating barriers for Indigenous people to get access to those foods if they want. That would also include newcomer and other cultural foods. And so talking really specifically about, where is the best places for those things to be accessed in Saskatoon, and how do we build a system where people can actually, one, afford to buy them, and two, get access to purchasing them if they want to. Housing was a really highly problematic piece during the COVID response, because in COVID times, people were told to isolate, which if you don't have a safe, reasonable, effective, affordable place to isolate, then you were catapulted into this sort of space where you were either live rough sleeping, lots of folks were out rough sleeping, but also in spaces of overcrowding or inappropriate places to isolate. And so there was a lot of conversation early on in the COVID response around how can people actually follow the public health measures when housing inadequacy is such a huge crisis in this province. It led to conversations around hotel isolation. So there's a project called ACES. It's an isolation hotel for folks who are awaiting positive results and or are positive with COVID and have nowhere to go. But even after the ACES isolation stay, they were medically discharged either back to shelter or back to nothingness. And so there was a fundamental breakdown in accessing affordable, appropriate housing when that isolation stay was over. We had serious issues with folks who were in shelter who couldn't be in shelter throughout COVID for a variety of different reasons, not being able to access other housing options. We also know that there are large vacancy rates in the city that are held by the Housing Authority. Despite our multiple attempts to advocate to free up those vacant units, we never really got access to them in a way that would be beneficial to the folks who would be living there. And we also realized that even if we could free up those vacant units, many of the people who would be moving into them required intensive case management and supports. And along the same time period, we saw the income assistance program changing so that direct payment to landlords disappeared, direct payments to utilities disappeared, and the Ministry of Social Services decided that money would go directly to clients and that those clients could then just take care of their own responsibilities. And now, moving out of COVID and into sort of a normal, we're seeing high eviction rates. I think September saw upwards of 50% of folks not in, or 50% of people in arrears because of this. And then the October data was just released yesterday, and we're seeing the same amount of people in arrears again. And so, as we're like 10 minutes to winter, this breakdown between access to income, public policy around social services, and evictions and homelessness is going to be highly problematic. Need to drink some water. And then we know Saskatoon has a really fairly established emergency housing shelter, and we have some really amazing affordable housing providers. What we're missing is the operationalization of the continuum between emergency and affordable or market housing. And so that in-between stage is transitional housing, maybe long-term, could be short-term transitional housing, but that is harm reduction-based modeling. We don't have a harm reduction-based model for shelter. There are no shelters in town that allow active substance use to happen. And so there are a group of folks who then fall through cracks that do not have access to any of those services. And so we really need to take a look at what is the full spectrum of actions that are required around housing, and then how do we operationalize them. Justice. So early on in COVID, you'll remember, maybe if you're paying attention to the media, that there was a release from justice piece where people who were in remand were released back to community. Early on, I kind of flippantly was asking for data around, what happened to those folks. Did we see a massive increase in opportunistic crime because people were released from remand and were then sort of wreaking havoc in general community? You might be very surprised to realize that that data doesn't exist. And in fact, anecdotally, police service, et cetera, says that they didn't see a marked increase in any kind of opportunistic crime when hundreds of people were released from remand early. What we did see, though, was alternatives and community-based programming and community-based supports provided to those folks. And so why can't we talk about alternatives to remand so that we actually dismantle and displace the apprehension that often comes from particularly women, but a growing number of single parents, single fathers as well, who interact with the justice system, who end up losing their children because of a remand stay. And so we really want to take a look at what's going on for alternatives to remand and offer a community-based model that would be a bit more proactive and supportive to folks. And then also a bit of an awareness piece specifically around the inequities facing women with children and how the barriers across jurisdictions, across sectors, particularly pertaining to the return of their children. Technology is one that we added in as well. So halfway through, maybe in the COVID years are almost together, but maybe in the summer of 2020, we started advocating for access to Wi-Fi. And you may have noticed that the city of Saskatoon had some infrastructure money come from the federal government, and they made a $250,000 investment in a public Wi-Fi pilot project. That pilot project is set to be launched fairly soon. It's meant to run for a year or so to see the efficacy of it. And then what our hope is that it will go really well, and we'll then be able to replicate it across the city, and we'll be able to talk about what the resourcing looks like. Many big urban settings have public Wi-Fi systems in place so that when you visit there, you don't need to worry about your data plans, etc., but also so that people who may not be able to get access to data have access to public Wi-Fi. When I was talking, I just had an update meeting with the team about this project. When I was talking to them originally, our intent was to make the broadband access as low as possible, but that's that thought process has changed dramatically, and so they're going to strive for actually decent quality broadband, because we don't believe that people should be limited to what they need to do on the internet, and by limiting the broadband, we're limiting access to a bunch of different things. And so if FaceTime or other like Zoom, etc., didn't work on this broadband network, we're then limiting access to, say, parents or grandparents who live in the north to be able to get access to their grandkids via technology. So all of the broadband that we'll be putting in place will be able to support that level of access. And then in the document, you'll see there's 3 priorities that were identified by the interagency response. So we're committed to working with the city to make sure that those priorities happen, and you can check them out in the document. The last piece is about navigation. What we learned in COVID is that folks who live in poverty, particularly folks who are like deeply entrenched and deeply tied to the street, need human interaction. And when things were closing, very quickly we opened a face-to-face space. You cannot easily navigate, I'm sure this is not surprising to any of you, you cannot easily navigate the human service systems, particularly like accessing income assistance or getting a income assistance worker to phone you back or even to answer the phone, etc., those kind of things. And so we realized really quickly that we need some kind of coordinated, centralized system navigation system. And there's a bunch of folks in community right now who are working on those pieces. It would be tied to things like 211. Comfy's working on a really cool project around system navigation and access to terminals that would have information. And then there are spaces that people just needs to go to get access to those services. So what can we use our existing infrastructure to be able to build a network? So there really is no wrong door, and people know where to go. And if they show up somewhere and it is the wrong place, that the people that they show up to know the right place for them to go to, and I can assist with that. And so building those kind of policies and practices and at a community level, but also how does the ministry policy and practice feed into that will be a critical part to the system navigation. All right, so that's the bold ideas. The next steps for us for SPRP is basically to reconvene all of the action pieces. And so each of the bold ideas has an action team. They have co-leads, or they will have co-leads. Some of the co-leads are already in existence. And what we'll do then is inside, we'll unpack them even deeper and set up work plans and the sets of goals. On top of the action teams for the 12 ideas, we also have a commitment to reconciliation. And so we're working on embedding calls to action and calls to justice into all of that action team work. We also have an evaluation team, which is a bunch of eval geeks. So if you love evaluation and you want to talk about data, there's an entire evaluation team. We had a PhD student work on a theory of change for us. We have a values framework. We're just going to work on some indicators and create a reporting structure. And then the last piece is that we have always had an ongoing lived experience team. It's kind of small right now, and we certainly would welcome a bit more insight to that community of practice. And so there is funding for the lived experience team as well. So if that's of interest to you, then you can get in touch with us and we can get connected to that work. And that's it. You can see us. Again, I'm like a halftime coordinator, so the social media is pretty lame. I apologize. I do my best to post a couple of things on Facebook. We have a Twitter account, but Twitter is kind of a toxic space right now, and I kind of try to avoid it. I have been contemplating an Instagram account, but basically it'll probably just be email and Facebook. And then right now, most of our stuff is in a Google Drive. So you can download the full report. If you don't dig Google Drives and you just want me to send you the PDF, then shoot me an email and I can send you the PDF. And that's it. Enough time for questions now? Not bad.
Wonderful, Colleen. Yeah, how about if you have any questions or comments, please do share them in the chat. I see one question that was asked way back when you were talking about washrooms. What about gender neutral washrooms?
I'm just going to stop sharing. I don't think we need to see anything. Then I get to see humans instead of like my screen, if that's okay with everybody. Yeah, so the washroom model will talk about gender neutrality. I think what we're trying to do right now is get a real feel for where the washrooms are. If you look at other urban centers across Canada, the first thing that you'll notice is that their municipal government invests resources, energy, staff, et cetera, in a 24-hour or a roughly 24-hour model. So if you look at Edmonton, theirs is open for 22 hours, but it's also tied to other things. So there is a municipal investment there, but they also talk to the surrounding businesses. So if you know Edmonton well, there's one on White Ave. You know that White Ave has a lot of bars. You know that there's a high pressure need probably when bars let out, et cetera. And so there's a conversation and supports through bylaws and taxation for businesses to allow their washrooms to be public access without purchase. And so we're having those conversations around, so where would a municipal piece of infrastructure go? Maybe it already exists because we do have municipal infrastructure. Many of it's not winterized. So if we talk about winterizing it, and then the other piece of it is staffing it. So many of those urban centers have staffed washrooms. And if you look at Edmonton's particularly, it's staffed with folks from the community. So it is a social enterprise model that's run with people with lived experience of poverty and of street connection. And so they provide system navigation and supports to people throughout the evening hours when people generally feel less safe or more worried about the intentions of use of the washrooms. But yes, gender neutrality would be definitely one of the things we'll be talking about.
I don't like to type. Can I ask the question and booze you, Colleen?
Hey, Lynn, how are you?
Good. I'm wondering, do you guys, I was here during the summer and they were suffering real hard downtown and the core neighborhood. Is there a place that we can get a warming center, a place for showers, a cooling station because they were overheating and there was no one was giving out water? You didn't even have what we call a cooling station. It's just a sprinkler system where they can go under. You have one in front of the Friendship Inn. You needed it a lot more. And washrooms are vital, you guys. Is there a way that you could work on getting these containers that have showers and washrooms, and then you go in and you just clean them out as soon as one's done? And when you have those, don't have people that don't work in the community. Have people monitor themselves. You can't be bringing in people. Our people can do their own things.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are all the things, Lynn, that were identified this past summer. There was actually a temporary public washroom structure, like just about ready to be set down. And then the location that it was supposed to go into became problematic with the owner. But you're right, there is like ongoing problems with the cold or extreme weather strategy. And those pieces are currently under SHIP, right? And so the Saskatoon Housing Initiatives Partnership. And so that group is working on making sure that those warm up, well, because it's 10 minutes to winter, those warm up places are ready to go. The problem is that so like, you know, Station 20 West, right? Last winter, that space was used as a warm up. And so there was food and other things offered to folks. And they ran a lot of extended hour warm up space. The problem with it this year is that Station 20 West is a vaccine clinic. And so that space now has disappeared. And so now we're like, you know, we don't want the vaccine clinic to disappear because people in the core need access to the vaccines and proof of vaccine printing, but we also need the warm up space. And so how do we run both, or what do we do? And so the amount of infrastructure, and you know this too, Lynn, like the amount of infrastructure in that corridor from like St. Paul's to Idlewild on 20th there are some good spaces, but there are ownership issues around whose space is what that we need to get over.
So my question would be, if you get these containers that have these washrooms. You can put them, and then no one owns them. You just put them on a piece of land. Why wouldn't put it by Station 20 West?
Yeah, because there's no space to put it at Station 20 West. No safe space.
I kind of know that, but
Yeah.
just that's
So
what
I mean,
we do here.
that was the location, Lynn, that we were, and we don't need to go down a rabbit hole, but that was the location that empty lot, because you know the old Kinsman building that's been for sale for a while. So that was the space that it was going to go into, but that building actually is for sale. And so it's not conducive to the sale of your real estate to have a temporary community-based washroom on it. And so we weren't allowed to use it anymore. But it's an ongoing conversation. And it's not that the folks who own it were against a washroom. It's just that they're trying to sell the property. And so if it's sold halfway through, we'd have to move the washroom anyway. But you're right, it's an ongoing issue.
And I did also have one concern. When you're in midst of COVID, no one was handing out hand sanitizers or handing out masks. Is there a way that we can do that now?
We definitely were. So the interagency response to COVID-19 spent $385,000 handing out those supports to people.
Because in the core neighborhood, I was down there twice in the summertime. They said there's nothing for us.
Well,
unless you go into these organizations, and they weren't about to go into these organizations. So maybe what I was getting at, you actually need people to walk. You need to engage with them. You need to be where their space is, not to have them in your space.
Yeah, and so OPG and a bunch of street outreach folks were providing all of those services all through COVID. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I honestly, like, I talked to the community, they didn't know where to get masks or anything. So I don't know if there's a disconnect, because I'm talking to the people in the community. They said they did nothing for COVID. So that tells me something very different than what you're saying.
I'm wondering if we can continue this conversation maybe offline, just noticing the time, but thank you so much for your comments. And I see there's a few other questions in the chat, but I'm going to just be mindful of the time and just sort of say thank you so much to Colleen for being here, and just for sharing this really important work that the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership is involved in, and for sharing your incredible expertise and knowledge on this topic. It was, although I've heard sort of, what's been going on in the last, I feel like I'm constantly learning so much more. So I just really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for joining us. It's too bad we don't have too much time for comments and questions, but we definitely hope to sort of continue this conversation in future webinars. So I've included in the chat a link to a feedback form. And in there's questions around, future topics. So if there's any pieces even in this particular presentation that you're like, I want to learn more about that specifically, or even just want further resources, anything like that, certainly add that there. Or I'm also going to leave my email in the chat, and you're welcome, or I'll even just give the DSA email. Feel free to get in touch with us. And yeah, just thanks again, Colleen and SPRP, for your tireless work in this area. And, working to make poverty a public health priority for our city and our province. It's really important. So thanks again, everybody.